My name is Ava Harper. I'm 30 years old, a software engineer. I spent most of my youth working day and night, saving every dollar until I finally bought my penthouse, the first home I owned entirely on my own. I thought it would be my safe place proof that I could stand without leaning on anyone. But at my brother's wedding, right there under the lights and music, my father stepped up, his voice heavy with alcohol, and said, "Give the penthouse to your brother. He just got married. He needs it more than you." I froze. When I refused, he slapped me across the face in front of hundreds of guests. I heard my mother whisper, "Stop embarrassing the family, Ava." And in that moment, I realized to them I was never really a daughter. I was just something they could take from whenever they wanted. My cheek burned, but instead of crying, I smiled. "You'll all regret this." That night, I walked out of the ballroom and began a plan none of them ever saw coming. And so, on the day my brother Nick married, every old wound I had carried quietly for years was about to be split wide open. That thought stayed with me as the music swelled and the room shimmered under soft lights. I was standing near the dessert table because it felt safer to hold a plate than to hold a conversation. I told myself I would smile, offer a toast, keep the peace, and go home. Then my parents walked up. My father's jaw was set the way it always was when he had already decided what the right answer should be. My mother's smile looked like a lid pressed tight over a pot about to boil. He did not ask how I was enjoying the wedding. He did not ask anything at all. He said, "Give the penthouse to your brother. He needs a home to begin his life." My mother nodded without looking at me, as if the matter had already been settled. "Be reasonable, Ava. You are only one person." The room felt smaller at once, and yet I saw more than I usually saw. I noticed a camera crew standing far from the dance floor, not filming the couple, not filming the speeches, but turned toward us with a lens that never blinked. I noticed the way my mother shifted to the side so the camera could see my face. I noticed my father's hand lift and fall like a judge who had found a guilty verdict before the trial. I put my plate down. I said no. I said it calmly. I bought that home with my own work. It is mine. I will not give it up. My mother's eyes flicked toward the nearest table, as if to measure who was listening. My father's breath smelled like bourbon and long-held anger. I felt his heat before I felt his hand. Then the music faltered just a note long enough for 500 guests to go quiet. The sound of his palm against my cheek cracked like something breaking in the ceiling. I tasted blood. My lips stung. Somewhere a glass touched the floor and did not shatter. My mother's fingers trembled at her necklace. My brother did not rise. He did not speak. He watched me with a small smile, the kind you give when a plan is moving the way you wanted it to. For a moment I could hear only my own breath. It came slow. I kept my hand still. I lifted my head. I let them see my face. I let the silence belong to me. Then I said, "You will regret this. All of you will." I did not shout. I did not need to. The words carried because no one else was speaking. They travelled past the head table and across the dance floor and into the quiet where a song had just died. I saw the camera operator freeze lens fixed on me as if they had been waiting for that very line. I saw my mother's mouth open and then close. I saw my father take a half step forward and I took none at all. I turned. I walked toward the doors. My heels struck the marble with a steady rhythm that sounded to me like a gavel marking the end of a case. No one followed. I noticed that too. People studied their plates. Someone coughed. The band picked at a note and let it fade. Outside the ballroom, the air felt colder, but it cleared my head. The sting in my cheek settled into a dull throb that told me I was awake and I was done pretending. I stood for a breath at the edge of the corridor and looked back once, not to find a forgiving face, but to fix the moment in my mind. I wanted to remember where I had been when I chose myself. Then I left. The valet asked if I needed a car, and I said I would walk. The night air felt honest. My phone buzzed in my hand, a string of messages arriving all at once, but I did not look. I kept walking until the music behind me was only a memory. On the sidewalk, I paused beneath a streetlight and pressed my fingers to my lip. It hurt. It reminded me what a line feels like when it is finally drawn. I thought of that camera too, still too ready, and I decided I would not forget that detail. Not because I needed attention, but because truth is easier to carry when it is not only yours. Later, I would ask a guest for a copy of what they recorded, not to shame anyone, not yet, but to make sure the story could not be changed on me again. At the curb, a woman in a pale dress stared at me, and then pretended she had not. I almost told her I was fine. I almost apologized for making a scene at a party that was never mine to spoil. But I had already given enough apologies in my life. I lifted my chin, breathed, and walked on. The city lights made a scattered path in front of me, and I followed it one quiet step after another until the building was behind me, and the night was just the night. The pain on my face would fade. The ache in my chest would not fade soon, but it would teach me something I should have learned earlier. You cannot keep giving what people will only take. You cannot hand over your home and hope they will leave your heart alone. Under that thought, another settled in firm and simple. I was not alone. I had myself. I had my work. I had a door I could close. I had a voice that would no longer live in a whisper. So I did the only thing that felt right. I went home. I washed my face. I sat by the window and watched the lights move across the harbour. I let anger pass through me until it became resolve. My phone kept buzzing. I turned it face down on the table and let it buzz. I did not need to answer anyone that night. I would decide what came next and when. I would choose a time and a place, and I would be ready. And when I spoke again, every word would count. With that promise still warm in my chest, I did not go straight home. I walked until the music behind me faded to a memory, then turned toward the only place that had ever felt steady when the rest of my life shook. Juniper and black was almost empty, the kind of late hour when chairs wear a soft hush and lights sit low like they are listening. Mark looked up as the bell on the door gave a small ring. He saw my face and did not ask what had happened. He only nodded and reached for the mug he always used for me. He set the cup down at my usual table by the window and placed a small muffin beside it. On the house, he said quietly, "You look like you need it." "Thank you," I said, and my voice sounded like it had come a long way to arrive here. He moved back to the counter and left me with the view, the cup, and my breath. I wrapped my hands around the warmth and let it steady me. The first sip landed deep, familiar and strong, and with it came the weight I had been holding up since the slap. My eyes stung. I told myself I would not cry because I did not want to give anyone more of me than they had already taken. Then the tears came anyway. They were not soft tears. They were hot and clear, the kind that carry anger out in a clean line so you can finally see what is left. I let them come because I knew what they were. They were the sound of the part of me that had stayed quiet for years, taking a deeper breath. When they eased, I watched the dark water beyond the glass. The harbour lights wavered like small promises. My cheek ached, but beneath that ache was something steadier than pain. I opened my bag and took out my laptop. The sound of the hinge felt like a step forward. The screen lit my hands. I wrote to Rachel first, kept it simple. I told her I needed to talk about personal safety, about a video, about options. Then I checked my accounts, not to count every number, but to remind myself of what I had built with long nights and early mornings. I thought of the places I could move if I had to of a corner unit I had once saved in a folder for one day, of the way owning even a small share of a building could change the balance when people tried to push you out of your own life. I did not have to decide everything tonight. I only had to decide the next right move. I wrote a note to myself to contact a guest who had filmed the ballroom when the music broke, and to reach the videographer if the guest did not respond. I wanted the truth saved somewhere that did not live only in my body. I set the cup down and felt another piece slide into place. The coffee tasted stronger now. Mark came by and asked if I needed anything else. I said I was all right. He nodded like he believed me and left me alone again. In the quiet, another memory rose, one I usually kept buried because it could still sour my tongue if I let it. I was 17 the year I won a summer scholarship. It was the first time a stranger had said my name with pride and handed me a letter that felt like a door opening. I remember holding it to my chest and running home. I remember my mother at the kitchen counter and my father at the table. I remember the way their faces changed when I told them. "Your brother needs this more," my father said, and my mother reached for the phone before I could speak. By dinner, the letter was no longer mine. Nick took the spot and I stayed home. He told me not to be dramatic, said families share. I told myself I was being good, that we were all on the same side. Years later, standing in a dress at his wedding with the taste of blood in my mouth, I finally saw how that kindness had been twisted into a rule I was expected to live by forever. The memory hurt, but it also cleared the air. This was not new. It was a pattern, and patterns can be broken. I wiped my eyes with the side of my hand and looked back at the screen. I made a list, not a long one. Tomorrow, call Rachel, ask for a meeting. Save the video if the guest replies. If not, ask the videographer. Review the file of that corner unit and a second option across the harbour. Check on the small investments I could move if I needed to. None of it was a fight. It was preparation. It was the work of someone who had decided to be the person in her own life who does not wait to be saved. The door opened and the night air moved across the floor. A couple walked in, laughing the way people do when their world is still simple. I watched them choose a table and sit close. I felt a small pull inside me that was not envy. It was a wish for quiet days that do not need courage. I closed my laptop and finished the last of my coffee. The muffin had cooled, but it tasted like care. When I stood, my legs felt steadier. Mark glanced up. I thanked him. He only said, "See you soon," like a promise that did not ask for anything in return. Outside, the street had thinned to a few cars, and the soft hum that comes when a city decides to rest for a while. I walked slowly, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to feel the difference between the girl who had walked out of that ballroom and the woman who now knew where she would place her feet. I pressed my fingers to my cheek. It would bruise. People might talk. None of that would decide my next step. When my phone lit up again, I let it face the ground in my pocket. There would be time to answer what needed answers. There would be time to refuse what did not. At the corner, I stopped and looked back toward the water one more time. The lights were steady now, not wavering at all. I turned toward home. I would sleep, I would wake, I would make my calls. I would put the truth where it could not be erased. And when I spoke again, I would not need to raise my voice. I would only need to be clear. And that promise followed me home like a steady hand at my back. I unlocked my door and stepped into the quiet I chose for myself. The air inside was cool and clean, full of the small sounds I know by heart. The soft hum from the fridge, the distant city breath against the windows. I set my keys in the bowl by the entry and stood still for a moment, letting my eyes travel over the rooms, the way you look at a face you love. This place did not happen by accident. It was built out of long nights and early mornings, and the simple truth that no one was coming to save me. I walked to the kitchen and put on a kettle, not because I needed tea, but because the soft click and the rise of warm steam made it easier to breathe. While I waited, I leaned my hip against the counter and let the past come forward without fighting it. I remembered the years when I worked 60-hour weeks that stretched into more. I remembered leaving one building when the sky still felt half asleep and walking into another where the lights never blinked. I remembered the taste of cheap coffee at midnight when the city was quiet and the only sound was fingers on keys and a tired heart telling me to keep going. I remembered falling asleep at a small wooden table in a corner of juniper and black with my cheek on my sleeve, and waking to the soft clink of a mug placed near my hand. I remembered saying no to weekends away, and no to dinners I could not afford, and no to the easy way that always ended up costing more. I watched the kettle wake and thought of the day I signed my name on the deed. The room at the closing office smelled like paper and lemon cleaner. No one clapped, no one cheered. I did not need them to. I held the pen and wrote my name and felt a door open in my chest. When I walked through the empty apartment for the first time, every footprint sounded like something that belonged to me. I touched the windows. I stood in the middle of the living room and closed my eyes. There was no furniture and no art on the walls, but there was a feeling I had never had before. It was not joy exactly. It was relief. Relief that the shape of my life could be chosen by me and paid for by me and answered for by me. When the kettle clicked off, I poured the water and carried the cup into the living room. I sat near the window where the city lights hang like small lanterns and thought about how I had filled this place, not with trophies or things meant to impress, with a table that fit my hands, with a chair that held a tired body without complaint, with plants that needed light and water and time, with a bed that faced the dawn so I could remember to start again. I remembered the first night I slept here, the way the quiet felt almost too big until it settled around me like a blanket I had earned. That was the night I promised I would not ask anyone to give me what I could build for myself. Later, when my family came to see it, they looked around and spoke in that careful way people use when they have already decided to be disappointed. My mother said it felt cold. My father said it was modern, as if that were a flaw. Nick laughed and asked where I would put a high chair, as if my worth lived in a future he had chosen for me. I kept my hands folded and said nothing. The truth was simple. Warmth is not a sofa you point at. Warmth is knowing no one would take the seat from under you. I sipped my tea and let that thought settle. I knew then what I know now. This home is not a prize or a decoration. It is a promise I made to myself and kept. It is the line that says, my life cannot be written by anyone else. It is a shield, and it is a lesson, and it is a quiet that belongs only to me. I stood and walked the rooms as if counting blessings. The small scratch on the hallway floor where I dropped a box my first week in. The faint ring on the coffee table from the night a friend cried, and I forgot a coaster and we both laughed anyway. The nail hole behind the bookshelf I hung wrong and rehung right and decided to leave as a reminder that I can fix what I break. In the kitchen, I touched the edge of the counter I saved for months to afford and chose because I liked the way light moved across it at noon. In the bedroom, I laid my palm on the window and felt the cool glass steady my skin. I thought of all the nights I ate simple food at the small table by the window while the city moved below me, and I did not feel lonely. I felt the quiet shape of my own company, and it was enough. If anyone asked why I would not hand this place to my brother and call it love, I would tell them the truth. Love is not asking the one who stood alone to step aside again. Love is not turning a woman into a spare part to be used when a man has a plan. Love is not telling a daughter that her work is less warm than a son's want. I set the empty cup in the sink and pressed my fingers to the counter. My cheek still ached, but the ache made my thoughts sharper. I could hear my father's demand. I could hear my mother's polished worry. I could see my brother's small smile. None of that changed what this place is. It is my line in the sand. It is the proof that kindness without respect is just a way to keep a woman quiet. I turned off the kitchen light and the room slipped into a softer dark. From the window, the city looked like a scattered necklace. I stood there and let the view hold me a while. They see a penthouse. I see every night I refused to give up, every morning I chose to begin. The clear feeling from the cafe moved through me again. I would keep what is mine. I would protect what I built. I would not raise my voice, but I would not step back. I locked my door and checked the bolt the way I always do. Then I went to bed and let sleep come not as an escape, but as a way to gather strength for what comes next. When morning arrived, I woke with light pressing through the curtains and a heaviness still resting on my cheek. The bruise had deepened in colour, tender under my fingertips, but it reminded me of why I had to stay firm. I chose a dark blouse and simple trousers clothes that felt practical but strong and tied my hair back so my face showed without hiding. I wanted to look like someone who could not be bent. I had just poured water into a glass when the phone rang. The doorman's voice was calm, but his words made my chest tighten. "Miss Harper, your parents are here. They weren't announced." I closed my eyes. Of course they weren't. They had always believed they could come into my life uninvited. I told him I would handle it. Instead of letting them knock at my door, I stepped out into the hallway, my keys still in hand. I turned the lock firmly, the sound sharp in the quiet corridor, and slipped the keys into my pocket. My father was already pacing his shoes, clicking against the polished floor, his jaw clenched as if the hallway itself had disobeyed him. My mother stood a step behind pearls tight at her throat, her face pale but composed. She spoke first. "We need to talk about last night." Her voice carried more fear than care. My father barked, "Where are you going?" as if I still owed him an answer. "Work," I said evenly. "Some of us actually have jobs." His eyes narrowed. He took one step forward, and before I could shift away, his hand clamped around my arm. The grip was harsh, his fingers digging into the fabric of my sleeve. My chest flared with the old fear that came from being held in place, but this time I didn't swallow it. I pulled back and met his stare. "Touch me again, and I'll call security." My voice was calm, almost too calm. His eyes flashed not with shame, but with surprise that I had dared to say it aloud. He squeezed once harder, then released me. My arm throbbed where his hand had been, but I straightened my sleeve and stood firm. I looked at them both. My father stiff, my mother trembling in silence. "You should know," I said, "there are cameras at the country club. High resolution, multiple angles. Everyone saw what happened." My mother blanched, her lips parting, but no words coming. She was thinking not of me, but of the whispers that might follow her into luncheons and charity events. My father's jaw flexed the way it always did when he was calculating what he could still get away with. I pressed the elevator button. My hand trembled slightly, but I kept my face steady. The small chime rang and the doors slid open. I stepped inside, turned to face them and said, "I won't waste more time on this." My father's eyes burned with the need to reassert control. My mother's hand reached for him as if to hold him back. The doors slid shut, closing on their stunned faces. Inside the elevator, the silence pressed close. I leaned against the wall and finally let out the breath I had been holding. My hand shook in small bursts, the fear still alive under my skin, but it no longer ruled me. I whispered to myself, "Not broken, not silent, just done." The words sounded stronger in the small space, like they belonged to me now. The elevator carried me down, floor by floor each moment, putting distance between me and the grip that once held me too easily. When the doors opened at the lobby, I stepped out with my shoulders squared, the bruise on my cheek hidden in plain sight, the echo of their silence still behind me. For years, I had let them walk into my life without knocking. For years, I had let their hands rearrange my choices. but not anymore. Locking that door behind me and standing in that hallway with their eyes on me, I had drawn a boundary that was no longer just words. It was real. It was mine. And as I walked into the sunlight, I knew this was only the beginning of holding it. I kept that feeling with me all the way to my desk, where the room was plain and quiet and the light from the window fell across the table like a clear path. My cheeks still ached, a steady throb that told me the past 24 hours were not a bad dream. But it did something useful too. It kept me from drifting. I opened my laptop, not for work, but for the thing I had avoided because I already knew it would change how I saw my family. My brother's old project, Orex. I thought of the early days when he came to me with careful words and said he needed a second pair of eyes. He asked me to look over his plan, to share a few drafts to point him toward a cleaner way to build. I said yes, because that is who I was, then the one who helped, the one who said of course, the one who believed we were on the same side. I gave him mock-ups. I gave him notes. I gave him hours I did not have. He called me an early consultant in an email and left it at that. When the company collapsed a year later, he told anyone who would listen that markets were cruel, that timing had gone wrong, that it was nobody's fault. He never mentioned the drafts I had shared. He never mentioned my name at all. I took a breath and opened the old account he set up for me back then. Part of me expected a locked door. It opened without a pause. He had never removed my access, the same way he never thought about what he owed anyone. The screen filled with folders dates the dry bones of a company that had burned down. I clicked through the code and felt my stomach go tight. 8 out of 10 lines were mine, only stripped of the comments I used to leave myself, and rubbed clean of my name. Where it was not mine, it was a rush of risky edits gaps, covered by quick fixes pieces that did not belong together, forced into place. I sat still and let the anger rise and pass. I wanted to see clearly. I moved past the files that built the product and opened the ones that lived behind it. Invoices that did not add up. Payments to companies with names I had never heard of. Dollar amounts that curled into each other and then disappeared. And then a name I knew too well showed up again and again. Harper and Associates, my father's side firm. The chair under me cooled. I scrolled and found transfer after transfer. Routed through that, name money moved in from investors who had trusted my brother. Money moved out in ways that made my hands go cold. This was not only carelessness. This was not only a son raised to believe the rules would bend for him. This was theft, hiding inside a family story. It hit me like a clean strike. They had not just turned away from me when I needed them. They had taken from me from my work and from other people too, and then washed it under our own last name. I heard my voice in the quiet low and even. They did not just abandon me, they exploited me. The truth of that line steadied me. It turned my shaking into something I could use. I saved every file to a secure drive and then printed what I needed to hold in my hands, because paper has a way of telling you that things are real. I slid the sheets into a plain folder and placed it in my bag. I sent a short message to Rachel that said I needed to meet, that I had documents that this was no longer about a family fight. I did not write anything angry. I did not need to. The pages spoke for themselves. At the window, the city went on with its day, and I watched the movement on the street as if it could remind me how to breathe in a steady way. I thought of my father's hand around my arm in the hallway, and his name sitting in those transfer lines like a stain. I thought of my mother's pale face and the way she clutched at her pearls, and how every worry she had was about what people might say rather than what had been done. I thought of my brother's small smile at the wedding, the one that told me he thought the whole world would lean to him the way we always had. It would not. Not now. I tucked the drive into a pocket of my bag and checked that the folder lay flat. I opened a clean page and made a simple list. Call Rachel first, Ask the guest for the ballroom video. If not, find the wedding videographer. Back up the files again and put one copy off-site. Keep my head down and my door locked. No scenes, no speeches. The time for scenes was over. The time for proof had begun. I closed the laptop and laid my palm on its cover, the way you do when you finish reading a letter that tells you what you already knew but could not say until now. I had thought for years that I was the one who kept the family from falling apart, that my patience mattered, that my silence was a kind of love. Now I knew better. My silence had been a tool they used because it was easy. That would change. I put on my coat, felt the weight of the folder against my side, and stood at the window for one more long breath. The light had shifted. The day had turned. So had I. I carried that thought with me when my phone buzzed the next morning. A message from my mother. She wanted to see me, just the two of us, she said. No father, no brother, no witnesses. For a moment, I almost ignored it, but I knew I couldn't. There were things between us that needed to be spoken, not for her sake, but for mine. I chose a plain shirt, tied my hair back, and slipped the folder into my bag. When I arrived at her house, the air was thick with the smell of fresh flowers and furniture, polished the kind of staged warmth she always wrapped herself in. She was waiting in the sitting room, pearls at her neck, a handkerchief folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes were red, but her posture was perfect. Ava, she said, her voice soft but tight. You embarrassed us. Do you know how many people called me after the wedding? She dabbed her eyes with the cloth, careful not to smudge her makeup. The whispers will never stop if you keep this up. I stood across from her, watching, not speaking, until the silence pushed against her words. I set the folder on the coffee table and slid it toward her. She frowned, hesitated, then unfolded a sheet. Her hand shook. The handkerchief trembled with it. Transfers, invoices, code, fragments, all laid out in black and white. My brother's theft, my father's laundering, my name erased. She swallowed, her lips moving, but no sound came. She pressed the cloth harder to her face as if it could hide what her eyes betrayed. You knew, I said quietly. Maybe not every detail, but enough. You saw what they were doing and you chose to smile and keep the house in order. Her hand fell to her lap, clutching the crumpled cloth. I leaned closer, my voice steady. You kept the family's image polished, but you lost your daughter inside it. She flinched at the words, her shoulders curling in as if I had struck her. For the first time in years, I felt no guilt, only grief for the mother I once hoped for. She shook her head. You don't understand, Ava. Families survive on unity. If this comes out, it destroys us all. She reached for me with her free hand, the pearls at her throat gleaming. I pulled back. Unity, I said, is not built on silence and theft. It is built on truth. She whispered something, maybe my name, but I did not let it hold me. I opened the folder wider, tapping the evidence with my finger. This is not mine to carry anymore. You need to know what I know, and you need to know my terms. She looked at me, then really looked, and for a second, I thought she might speak an apology. Instead, her lips pressed tight. So I told her plainly, I don't want your money. I don't want dinners or calls or promises that come with conditions. I want distance. I want silence. No more demands. No more letters about what Nick deserves. No more invitations dressed as traps. The penthouse is mine. My work is mine. My life is mine. Off limits. Do you understand? Her eyes glistened, but the tears were not for me. They were for the image of herself she could no longer protect. She pressed the handkerchief to her face again, folding it into a shape that looked almost like prayer. But she said nothing. Not a word of defense, not a word of love, just silence. I gathered the folder, slid the papers back inside, and stood. She stayed where she was, pearls shining cloth, damp in her hand, her whole body trembling with what she would never say. I looked at her one last time and felt the sorrow rise, but I did not let it break me. "You raised me to stay quiet," I said softly, "but I am done being quiet for you." I turned and walked out. The sound of my heels against her perfect floor was the only answer she gave me. Outside, the air was cooler, sharper, almost clean. I held the folder tight against my side and breathed in. I had not gained a mother's protection, but I had found my own voice, and that was enough. The very next evening, she called with a sweet invitation. A family dinner, she said, a small celebration for an anniversary, just us, no fuss. I could hear the shape of it before she finished the careful stage. The easy smiles, the way a room full of relatives could become a soft net around my throat. I said I would come. I dressed plainly and slipped the small drive into my bag. It felt no heavier than a house key, but I knew it could open more than a door. When I walked into the dining room, the lights were warm and the table was set in quiet perfection. Crystal, linen, the good plates. My mother moved like a hostess from a magazine, touching shoulders, offering kisses, pouring water, as if the world could be rinsed by the right glass. My father stood near the head of the table, stiff and watchful, his smile held together by pride and fear. Nick and Kayla were already seated, whispering in the way people do when they think they are safe. A cousin I hardly knew waved me over, and chairs scraped as they made room with theatrical kindness. My mother lifted her glass and began with the words I had expected. "Family is everything. We survive by holding each other up." A few heads turned toward me as if on cue. She spoke about forgiveness and unity, and how young couples need stability to start their life together. The same soft circle of pressure I had been hearing since I could remember, wrapped in a toast so no one would call it a command. I let her finish. I let the pause stretch long enough for the room to breathe in. Then I stood. I did not thank her for the invitation. I did not apologize for what would happen next. I reached into my bag and took out the small drive. "Where would you like me to plug this in?" I asked, my voice even because I brought some lovely family memories to share. The room shifted. My mother blinked. The projector for slideshows was already set on a side table, part of the plan she had made, in case she needed a softer tool to shape me. The cord lay coiled beside it like a quiet snake. I crossed the room, slipped the drive into the port, and pressed the button on the remote. The screen on the far wall glowed to life. First came a still image, the ballroom lights and the polished floor, and the head table familiar now, like a bruise you keep touching. Then the clip began. A guest had sent it to me the day after the wedding. A clear shot from the side where nothing was blocked and the sound did not blur. We watched my father lift his hand and bring it down. We heard the music falter and stop. We watched my face turn and then hold. No one spoke. A fork clinked against a plate and stayed there. My mother reached for her pearls as if the necklace could undo what the screen showed without shame. I pressed pause and let the silence stand. "This is what happened," I said. Not a feeling, not a rumour, not a misunderstanding. This. I pressed the button again. The next image was not a video. It was a simple set of records I pulled and printed and saved. Dates, amounts, the names of companies that did not make sense until they lined up like stepping stones across a dark stream. Transfers in and out, and the name I knew too well, repeated as if it were a signature on a bad letter. Harper and Associates. My father's business. I did not explain the shells or the invoices or what 8 parts of 10 meant when you stripped a woman's name from her own work. I let the room read. I let the numbers speak. My father's jaw did not move this time. My mother's handkerchief appeared in her fingers as if by magic, and she held it to her mouth without a word. Nick sat very still, a man who had always chattered now, learning the taste of quiet. The screen shifted through each page with a slow pulse. When the last page trembled into place, I pressed pause again and turned to face them. "You wanted my home?" I said. "Tonight, I take back the truth." I kept my voice low enough that they had to lean in, high enough that the cousins and aunts and uncles who never called could hear every word without asking me to repeat it. This is not about unity. This is not about a young couple starting their life. This is about taking and erasing and pretending it is love. I pointed to the first frame again, the frozen moment, when my father's hand met my face. "This is how you argued." And I pointed to the records. "This is how you paid for it." For a long breath, the room did not move. Then, the hum of the projector sounded louder than any speech. Someone at the far end cleared a throat. A chair creaked. My mother whispered my name, but it did not sound like a mother calling her child. It sounded like a woman trying to hold back a tide with a single word. I closed the file and pulled the drive free. The screen fell to blank a rectangle of light that made every face look pale. I slid the drive into my pocket as if it were any small thing I kept safe, and I picked up my bag. No one stood to stop me. My mother did not reach out. My father did not bark an order. Nick did not smirk. The room had become what they always made me be. Very quiet. I walked to the door and felt the floor under my feet as something that belonged to me. Not to this house, not to this story, not to the old rules that kept me on the side. At the threshold, I turned once and looked at the blank screen. It glowed like a soft ghost and showed them nothing, which was the same as the truth, now that they could no longer pretend. I left without closing the door behind me. The air in the hallway felt like it had waited for me to come up for it. When I stepped outside, the night held steady, and for the first time in a long time, so did I. The days that followed felt strangely quiet, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The whispers from that dinner began to spread. I had not released everything, only enough, a careful slice of truth that slipped through the cracks. It was enough to reach the right ears. A week later, I read in a business column that my father had stepped down from a board position. No statement offered, no reason given. But I knew. So did he. One evening, just after I'd made tea and set my laptop aside, there was a knock at my door. Not the hard rattle of someone demanding entry. Softer, hesitant. I checked the camera and saw him standing there alone. Shoulders squared out of habit, but his hands gave him away, fidgeting with his jacket, adjusting the cuff, as if he did not know where else to put them. I opened the door just enough to meet his eyes, but did not step aside. He looked smaller than I remembered, his jaw less certain, his voice lower. 5 minutes, he said. That is all I ask. I did not answer right away. I watched him stand there, no bourbon on his breath, no command in his tone, only the weight of someone who knew his ground had shifted. He cleared his throat. "They are moving back in with us," he said, finally, meaning Nick and Kayla. "They lost the apartment." I know I replied. I owned the building. His eyes blinked slow, as if the words did not fit together. "You," he said softly. "But how?" "Because I am good at what I do," I told him. "I always was. You just never noticed." For a moment the hallway was silent, except for the hum of the lights overhead. He looked down, his voice strained. "Your mother misses you. We all do." I felt the ache in those words, but I knew what sat behind them. "You miss having someone you could push around," I said. "Someone to give up her weekends, her home, her silence. That person does not live here anymore." He shifted, searching for a response, but I did not give him time. "The girl you could push around doesn't live here anymore." My voice was steady, not angry, not raised, only certain. He nodded once, a man who had lost his footing and knew it. I could see the fight leave his shoulders. For a brief second, I thought he might apologize, but instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "Your mother wanted you to have this. It is an invitation, her birthday dinner. family only. I took it, but did not open it. I held his eyes instead. I will think about it, I said. Then I closed the door. Not a slam, not a shove, just firm enough to make the wood meet the frame with a quiet finality. On the other side, I heard nothing. No protest, no shuffle of shoes. Only silence. I stood there for a moment, hand still on the knob, letting the quiet fill me. Not fear, not anger, only release. That door had been a line for most of my life, the place where they could always step through, uninvited, unchallenged. Tonight, it had become something else. A boundary that was mine to draw, mine to close, mine to keep. I leaned back against it and breathed in. The tea on the counter had gone cold, but it didn't matter. I felt warmer than I had in years. I whispered to myself, not broken, not silent, just done. And for once, I believed it. The next morning, the world felt almost ordinary. I made coffee, answered a few emails, and for the first time in weeks, thought I might settle into something steady. Then I saw it, a thick envelope slid under my door, with the seal of a bank printed in the corner. At first, I thought it was a mistake, maybe a generic notice. But when I opened it, my stomach dropped. It was a loan agreement. My penthouse had been mortgaged. The documents were crisp, the numbers heavy, and at the bottom, bold and final, was my name. My signature. Except it wasn't mine. The pen strokes were too smooth, the loops too perfect, like someone had practiced until they could almost pass as me. I stared at it so long I forgot to breathe. They had tried to take my home once by shaming me. Now they had found a way to do it on paper. My phone rang as I stood there frozen. The caller ID was the bank. A man with a careful voice began confirming details, the size of the loan, the repayment terms. I listened until my pulse steadied and then cut him off. That is not my signature. I never signed these papers. There was a pause, then the sound of his keyboard tapping. He said they had a notarized file, everything in order. My hand tightened on the envelope. Notarized. Someone had gone further than I thought. This was no accident. This was deliberate. I hung up and sat down at the table with the papers spread before me. I thought about Nick's easy grin, Kayla's hungry eyes, their endless schemes. Of course it was them. They had bribed someone or found a notary willing to look the other way, maybe even faked an ID. They had crossed a line that was not only cruel, but criminal. A pounding sound broke through my thoughts. The door shook under Nick's fists. Ava, open the door, we need to talk. His voice was frantic, sliding between charm and panic. I stayed quiet. He kept shouting, "You're overreacting. We can fix this. Let me in." Then his tone turned sharp. "Don't ruin us, Ava. Don't make this harder than it has to be." I could hear Kayla's voice in the background, a hiss urging him on. My chest tightened, not from fear, but from fury. I pressed my palm against the door, the same door I had closed on my father, and I knew I would not open it now either. They had already taken too much. They would not step over this threshold. The pounding slowed, then stopped. Silence settled again, but I knew it was not peace. They had planted a threat inside my life, a threat written in ink and validated by a stamp. My hands trembled as I gathered the papers, but then they steadied. Anger cleared the fog. If they thought I would crumble, they had forgotten who I had become. I picked up my phone and dialed Rachel. She answered on the second ring, her voice brisk, steady, exactly what I needed to hear. I told her about the envelope, the forged signature, the bank call, the hammering at my door. She did not sound surprised, only sharper. Bring everything, she said. We will start tonight. I closed my eyes and breathed, feeling the weight of the papers in my hands. This was no longer just betrayal. It was war. And this time, I would not hold back. I pressed the phone to my ear, my voice calm but fierce. If they want war, Rachel, they will have it. I said it cleanly into the phone, then carried the folder to her office and watched the way her eyes softened for a breath before they sharpened. She did not waste time. She laid out a simple plan on the table, steady and calm, and for the first time since the envelope slid under my door, I felt the ground return under my feet. "We start with what we can prove," she said. "We gather what the bank saw, what the systems recorded, what the paper itself can tell us." I nodded and slid the forged mortgage across the desk. She read in silence, then picked up the phone and set things in motion with a voice that sounded like a straight line. By that afternoon, a bank manager called back. We arranged to view the security footage, and when the screen lit up, we watched a woman dressed like me sit across from a clerk and produce an ID that carried my face but not my life. The camera did not flinch. Her hands moved with a nervous care, like someone afraid of getting caught and hoping to outrun it. Rachel said nothing, only wrote down the time and the desk number. We left with a copy on a drive and a promise of a signed statement from the branch. Next came the trail inside the forms. An analyst pulled the logs for the online submissions that had been used to file pieces of the loan, and I held my breath as the list of addresses and devices came into view. The entries dated back to a week when Nick had been loud online about a new plan, and there it was, a match that led to an address I knew, a place he had used before for his schemes. I felt rage rise and settle, then I watched Rachel mark each line, each time stamp each connection, building a quiet fence around a loud lie. For the signature itself, she called a handwriting expert, a careful woman who put my name and the forged name side by side and spoke without drama. "The pressure is wrong," she said. "The rhythm is wrong. The person who wrote this practiced, but they did not know the way your hand breathes in a line." I did not know my hand breathed until she said it, but I believed her, and I felt something in me breathe too. The last piece was the stamp that had given this fraud its cover, the notary. Rachel found the name and traced it through a string of quick approvals that made no sense until we saw a small picture on a social page, a group photo at a party, Kayla laughing with her arm around a woman whose name matched the stamp. It was not proof by itself, but it was a door, and when Rachel knocked on it with the right questions, the pieces started to fall. On the way back to her office, I stared out the window and let the rhythm of the street steady me. This was not revenge, I told myself. This was air returning to a room where it had been stolen. When we sat again, Rachel laid the stack between us and drew a breath that sounded like a verdict. "We will file to freeze any action on the loan," she said. "We will notify the bank fraud unit. We will prepare a complaint." I nodded, then took out a second set of papers I had been holding close. While this was unfolding, I told her I moved on something else. The corner unit at Hollowshaw. I signed for it. Her mouth curved in approval. "Not the whole building," she said. "No," I answered. "A prime unit and a controlling share in the association. Enough to have a voice that cannot be ignored." She smiled, then a small honest smile, and I felt the lift of being seen as capable, not as a daughter needing permission. In the days that followed, the machine turned. The bank paused the loan process and flagged the file. The notary received a call she could not charm her way out of, and the handwriting report arrived with the words I needed. The video from the bank branch sat on a drive in a drawer in my kitchen, and sometimes at night I would touch the edge of that drawer, not to relive, but to remember that truth can sit quietly and still be ready. Meanwhile, another process moved on without my hands. Nick and Kayla, 2 months behind on their rent, received the notice I had known would come. It was not a scene. It was paper in an envelope, dates and terms and consequences spelled out in plain type. They went to the office and argued. They said there had been a mistake, that someone else was to blame, that they only needed more time. They did not know, or they did not want to know, that the person with authority here was me. I did not go down. I did not stand in the lobby and watch them. I stayed upstairs in my kitchen with the window open and let the sounds of the city be the only witness to the end of one more story I had not written. The notices were served. The dates were set. They moved out quietly, no photos, no posts, no parties, just boxes and a thin line of anger that did not find a place to land. Through it all, I did not gloat. I did not tell myself I had won. What mattered was not their fall. What mattered was that the rules held for once that a line on paper could protect as well as harm, that I could move through this without becoming what had hurt me. When the last document was signed in Rachel's office, she pushed the file toward me and said, "You have done enough for today." I closed my eyes and let the weight leave my shoulders. On the way out, I passed a window that faced the harbour. The light there is different at every hour, but in that moment it was steady and kind, and I stood for a breath and let it rest on my face. I was not fighting to breathe anymore. I was building. I walked back to my car with my bag light at my side, the folder zipped and quiet, and thought of the next step I had avoided, but could no longer. It was time to face what could not be solved by paper alone. So, I asked Rachel to arrange a meeting with Nick at her office. When he walked in, he tried to smile, but it was weak, almost nervous. I didn't return it. I laid 2 files on the table between us. One held my original drafts, the lines of code, the designs I had poured myself into. The other carried his Orex version stripped of my name, but carrying my work like stolen bones. I spoke evenly, pointing to the pages. The similarities said more than I ever could. For a while, Nick argued, said everyone borrows, that I was strong enough to share. Then his voice fell. He stared at the table and whispered I had to be the centre. It was always you who held steady, you who were noticed, you who never failed. I needed something. His words cut deeper than I expected. I swallowed hard, then answered softly, all I ever wanted was a family. Not to be the star, not to be sacrificed, just a family. Silence hung heavy. Then Rachel cleared her throat and explained what he faced: the forged mortgage, the bank footage, the handwriting analysis, the notary tied to Kayla. Her words were precise, calm, and they left him pale. He begged me to keep it in. The family said no one else had to know. I shook my head. No, I will not carry this for you anymore. The law will decide. He left with slumped shoulders. That night, my phone lit up with 52 missed calls, one after another, desperate messages spilling into the dark. By morning, there was a knock at my door. I checked the camera. Nick stood in the hall, hands empty, face drawn. I opened the door, just a crack. His words rushed out, sorry after sorry, promises to pay it back, fears of prison. His voice cracked as he said it would destroy him. I let him speak until his pleas fell quiet. Then I asked the only question that mattered. Do you really think what you did deserves forgiveness? His face crumpled. He sobbed, said he didn't know how to be different, but he would try. I listened, steady but cold. Forgiveness isn't a key I can hand you, I said, and it isn't a shield you can hide behind. I don't know what I'll do with my part of this, but I won't save you from what belongs to the law. He shook his head, begged again, asked me to intervene to soften what was coming. I thought of the people he had defrauded of my own signature, bent into a lie of the years I'd been told to step aside for him. I shook my head again. Go home, Nick. Tell the truth. Don't ask me to carry this anymore. I closed the door before he could say another word. Not a slam, just enough. I stood with my hand on the wood and listened to his steps fade into the elevator. The apartment was quiet again. I picked up my phone and stared at the missed calls. There was a kind of power in not replying, in letting the silence do the work. I set it down and went to the window. The city stretched steady outside, unshaken by our storm. I realized I didn't need triumph or revenge or even his apology. What I needed was the boundary I had finally drawn, one that kept me whole. The next morning, I met Rachel and signed the papers we'd prepared. When I walked out of her office, I felt lighter. On the sidewalk, I knew the word for it. Not victory, not revenge, peace. I went home and let the day end without checking my phone. Whatever came next was no longer mine to carry. I had chosen my terms, and for the first time, that was enough. A week later, I decided to fill my home with voices that lifted rather than demanded. I set the table on my balcony, laid out glasses, plates, simple food I'd cooked myself, and when the evening came, Mark walked in first carrying flowers. Rachel followed with a bottle of wine and Jenna with her laugh that always makes the air easier. We sat beneath the open sky, the lights of the city stretching like a carpet below us, and for the first time in years, my home felt warm in the company of people who wanted nothing from me but my company. We talked about work, about books, about Rachel's daughter and Jenna's latest client, and Mark poured coffee the way he always does. There was no undercurrent of guilt or expectation, no eyes scanning the room to see if I was giving enough. Only the sound of chairs shifting of forks against plates of laughter that did not cost me anything. When the night wound down and the last plates were stacked, they hugged me goodbye one by one and promised to come again soon. I stood in the doorway and felt something quiet settle in my chest. This was what it meant to belong without paying for it. After they left, I found an envelope slipped under my door. My mother's handwriting was neat on the front. I carried it to the kitchen, sat at the counter and opened it. The note inside was short. I am sorry it read for teaching you endurance instead of protection. I read it once, then folded it back and placed it in a drawer. I did not tear it, I did not frame it, I simply kept it. Not as forgiveness, not as closure, but as a sign that even silence sometimes shifts. I did not cry. I only felt a little lighter, as if the weight I carried was now shared, even if only by ink on paper. Later that night, I went to the small cabinet where I keep the files. The server logs the payment trails, the screenshots, all the evidence that could bring my father and Nick down in an instant. I have never sent it. I may never send it. But it is there, a quiet shield, a sword hanging overhead, reminding me that they can never again pretend I am powerless. I closed the cabinet, turned the key, and stepped onto the balcony. The city was alive with its own hum, soft and steady, and I held my phone in my hand. On the screen, the number blinked 52 missed calls, all from Nick. I stared at it, then let my gaze drift to the skyline. The night air was cool, brushing my skin like a reminder that I was still here, still free. Forgiveness or not, I whispered, doesn't matter. What matters is that this time he knows I am the one who decides. I slipped the phone into my pocket and rested both hands on the railing. They tried to take my home, but instead they gave me something I never thought I would hold. My freedom. Those were the words I held on to as I stood there on the balcony. And I want to leave you with something too. Because I know if you've listened this far, maybe you have carried your own pain. Maybe you know what it feels like when the people who should have protected you were the very ones who broke you. I want you to know this. It does not make you weak that it hurt. It makes you human. And healing, real healing, is not about pretending it never happened. It is about choosing what you do with the hurt. For me, it meant drawing boundaries, finding voices that lifted me, instead of pulling me down and letting the silence of my own space feel safe again. For you, it may look different. Some people heal by writing their story, others by sitting across from a trusted friend and speaking out loud what was once kept inside. Some find it in prayer, some in therapy, some in the steady rhythm of a daily walk, or even in the quiet comfort of music that understands without words. What matters is not how you heal, but that you give yourself permission to. You are not meant to carry pain forever. You are meant to live, to breathe, to find peace in the space you call your own. And if this story has stayed with you tonight, if it has reminded you that your freedom is worth holding on to, then I hope you'll stay close. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this one. Not because you have to, but because sometimes it helps to be reminded again and again that you are not alone.